Let's begin tonight with the latest on plans for a trans-Tasman bubble. After a video meeting between Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern and Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison this morning, the two leaders say they are committed to introducing a trans-Tasman COVID-safe travel zone as soon as it's safe to do so. Scott Morrison says a trans-Tasman travel zone is still some time away, but he says the country is committed to introducing one. Speaking at his post-cabinet press conference, Scott Morrison said when Australia is ready to start opening its borders, New Zealand is an obvious place to start.
The Prime Minister and I have been now for several weeks been talking about a safe travel zone between Australia and New Zealand. It is still some time away, but it is important to flag it because it is part of the road back. At some point, both Australia and New Zealand will start connecting with the rest of the world again. And the most obvious place for that to start is between Australia and New Zealand. And we could see that happening, but it's not something that's about to happen next week or anything like that. It is something that will better sit alongside when we're seeing Australians travel from Melbourne to Cairns about that time. I would expect, everything being equal, that we'd be able to, fly from Melbourne to Auckland or to Christchurch or things like that.
Joining us now with more detail is our political editor, Jane Patterson. Hi, Jane. So they're committed to this, but what does that actually mean in practical terms?
Well, I think the commitment in itself is significant because, of course, there's been a lot of chat about the trans-Tasman bubble over the last couple of weeks, raised initially by Winston Peters in an interview with an Australian media outlet. So here we are a couple of weeks on, now a firm commitment between the two countries. The main thing, though, is when is it going to happen? And as you've just heard from Scott Morrison, no detail in the statement that the two leaders released today about when that could happen. But I think if you look at New Zealand's situation first, we have still in level 2, potentially going into next week. We still actually don't know whether we'd be able to travel regionally, let alone further afield. And Mr Morrison just alluded to some of the states in Australia still having closed borders to each other. So I would take from that his comments that those borders would have to be open within mainland Australia itself before trans-Tasman travel could happen.
So, as you say, no specific time frame here, just some vague-ish indications. National has repeatedly asked for a commitment to be made to setting this up by the end of the year. Does that seem realistic, all things being equal, what we know?
Look, the signals from the Prime Minister were certainly that it would be in the medium term. So she has said this week and the end of last week it wouldn't be in the next couple of weeks. So that's not an option, and Mr Morrison just reiterated that. But I think further than that it could be possible, especially with both countries really seeming to get the infection rates under control. New Zealand, of course, recording a second day of 0 cases. So all of those indications are good. But basically they said that they would have to have necessary health, transport and other protocols developed and met, but they did say that they would need to be cautious, and as we've heard both leaders say, they would really be reluctant to start any kind of travel before they were sure that people could do that safely, and there would still have to be measures that people would have to take travelling in terms of the ability to contact trace and recording where you've been and that sort of thing. So a lot to sort out, but one interesting thing in this is that they have said in the statement that once effective travel arrangements have been set up between Australia and New Zealand, both countries would then look further afield to the Pacific. Now that's a region that has been got away with not too much infection. They've managed it well. There'd be again a real reluctance to open up travel if it was going to expose the Pacific countries in any way, but tourism's important to them as well. So between Australia, New Zealand and the Pacific, it could see quite a lot of tourism activity and business activity resume, even within that quite tight regional focus.
The Pacific, though, is a much riskier prospect, isn't it, Jane? If you look at what happened with the measles outbreak in Samoa last year, when you look at the health system there and the availability of things like respirators, exporting any COVID cases to them could be catastrophic.
Absolutely, and I think that's reflected in the statement. It says expand the concept to members of our broader Pacific family, and they say in the statement we will work with interested Pacific countries. So this is something Australia and New Zealand will not be wanting to be seen to impose on the Pacific. The Foreign Minister, Winston Peters, though, has been talking about New Zealand's realm countries, in particular Niue and Rarotonga, as being within New Zealand's purview, so they could potentially offer better support, better health support, and that would have to be, I'm sure, part of any discussions or arrangements before travel started with those countries.
Jane, the other thing this statement says from the Prime Minister is that they're going to consult stakeholders and business leaders. So who do we think is going to get a say in all of this?
Well, of course, we have tourism operators around the country very, very concerned about the livelihoods, and especially once that wage subsidy ends in about 4 weeks. The ski season is one that's been talked about. Can this start up in time to get the ski season going? So tourism operators would be one, Air New Zealand, the transport operators would be another. Now, of course, Air New Zealand and other airlines have been flying Mercy flights. They continue to operate. So part of the plan would be to talk to Air New Zealand or talk to Australian airlines to see exactly how they could do this. We've had reports of domestic flights where there haven't necessarily been great social distancing and everything hasn't probably been as good as the government may have wanted. So in that case, that would be a huge part of it, to make sure that the actual transport part was safe and that everything was in place for that to be able to be done without risk of spreading the virus.
Thanks for the update, Jane. That is our political editor, Jane Patterson, joining us there from Parliament. That is, the Prime Minister's Australian and our own Jacinda Ardern are committed, they say, to moving to safe travel zones. In essence, a trans-Tasman bubble as soon as they are able to.